Hello, this is Professor Gibson. Here's a short video about Intro to Logic. All right, our chapter this week. So, there's two kind of key things you really need to do. One is to learn your definitions. And in this case, we're going to be talking about the definitions involved in 5 symbols. Okay. And then the other thing you need to do, want to learn to do, is to learn how to use truth tables. We're going to cover all of that here in this video, and just lasting a few minutes. So here's our 5 symbols. The squiggle here means not. The upward pointing arrow, if you will, means and. The downward arrow, or a capital V, however you want to think about that, is or. The single right arrow and the double right arrow both mean the same thing. If it's P arrow Q, then that means if P, then Q. All right? And then this arrow that points in both directions, again, P bidirectional Q, it means P if and only if Q. So practically, when we work with these, here's what their meanings are. The squiggle, the not, means opposite. So if you had not P, that would mean opposite of P. Okay? Now, so both the rest of these commands, typically, they're going to have a P and a Q on them, or some sort of variable. So if it's P and Q, it's true if, and it's true only if both are true. All right? So P and Q is false most of the time. It's true only when they're both true. The flip of that, the or, right, is false only if both are false. Okay, you got that? So it's false only if both are false, and it's going to be true the rest of the time. Here's the next statement, our if P then Q, right? Whether the single arrow to the right or the double arrow to the right, it's still if P then Q. Now this one is only false, right? It's false only if the first variable, the letter in front of the arrow is Q, is true, and then the letter after the arrow is false. Any other combination, an if-then is considered true, okay? So an if-then is only false if it's true followed by the false. And then the last is the arrow pointing in both directions here. We call that if and only if. This one is true when both are the same, all right? So it's true if they're both true, it's true if they're both false. And if they're not the same, then it's false. All right? So let's use this. The next thing is to use a truth table. You're going to want to memorize these things that I just said, all right? I know memorization is not everybody's favorite. It was never my favorite when I was a student either. But there's no real way around it. Seems to. All right, our next thing is how to use a truth table. So a truth table is a tool to make it so you only have to think about one thing at a time as you evaluate these statements. So like here's a typical statement. All right, so if P then Q, there's an or, not P. Okay, so what happens is you want to build up each of the statements that are in each of the smaller statements inside the bigger one, and then put them together at the end. So to the left of the or, our main statement here, we've got a P implies Q, right? Or if P then Q. Remember, this is only, our rule for this is only false if it's true, then false. So this is the only one that's false, which means the rest of these are true. All right. You'll note, see, I've written these in such a way as to make them as easy. My rules up here, I've written them in such a way as to make them as easy as possible to evaluate. So that's one of my statements, and I got an or. And the other thing over here that I've got is this not P. All right. Now remember, not means the opposite. Okay. Well, you look over here in the first column, P is true, true, false, false. Well, the opposite of that is just take the opposite of true is false, opposite of true is false, opposite of false is true, opposite of false is true. I'm going to tell you something. They tend to, in the questions, they'll give you these first columns where they tell you all the values for P and Q, and then they give you the last column, and you have to fill in the ones in the middle yourself. So when it comes to this point to use these, you don't need to do these, but it helps to have, I found it helps me to have these numbers in here when I explain stuff. All right. So this last statement here, if you think about it, the overall thing that we're doing is column 3 with this or in column 4, right? So what I have here is 3 or 4. Now remember the rule for or is true, or rather is false, only when both are false, right? So we're putting this column 3 and this column 4 together. The only place where both of these are false is right here in the second row, right? Well, that's false only when it's false, so that one's false. That means these others are all true. Okay? Now again, when they give you this in a question in the homework, they're going to tend to give you these first 2 columns and the last column. If you try to do all this in your head, it gets very hard to hold in your head. Do it do it one piece at a time. Make a column for each kind of item. So we have a P, an if P then Q, so that's its own column. We have a not P, that's its own column. Fill those out. And then you can look here. This is column 3 and column 4. I have an or in here, so it's 3 or 4, and then do the logic for that. All right, let's do another one. So this one's a little more complicated. So we're going to try this one here. Here's one thing we have P or Q, and then we have not P and not Q. All right, so the way I see this is we've got this whole big item over here. We have a P or Q, we have a not P, we have a not Q, and then we've got an and on both of those, okay? So we're going to make those columns one step at a time. So P or Q, remember this is only false when they're both false, so there's my false. All the rest of these are true. See how I've got these memorized? Like I know that or is false only when both are false. You're going to have that memorized, or you can have a little cheat sheet with you, but you want to have it at least pretty close to memorized with the cheat sheet to remind you just real quick. Now the next one, I need a not P. All right, P is true, true, false, false. So not P is going to be the opposite. False, false, true, true. And I'm also going to need a not Q. So I see Q is true, false, false. So the opposite is just going to be the flip of that. False, true, false, true. All right. Now we need to get this whole statement right here, right? So this is an and, if you will. So number my columns again. Just because it's easier to talk about once I do that. You may not need to number them when you actually do these on paper. I kind of like to, but a lot of people don't bother with it. Anyway, so if you look at this thing I just circled here is not P and not Q. It's really 4 and 5, right? The thing I like about this is the logic of it. What you're going to do is an and on columns 4 and 5. Remember the rule for and is true only when they're both true. So if I look down these, do we ever have any place where 4 and 5 are both true? Well, yeah, here's the only place 4 and 5 are both true. Right? So that's the only true. Well, then everything else is false. All right. Now we get to our conclusion. So P or Q, that was 3. And now we've got our two-way arrow. And then it's column, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is actually column 6 here. All right. So what I'll do, you can't see this on the video, but I'll kind of put my fingers here. And I'm just going to touch the first row in column 3 and the first row in column 6. Remember, so this right here is if and only if it's true when they're both the same, all right? Well, true and false are different, so that's false. True and false are different, so that's false. True and false are different, so that one's false. And false and true are different. So this one was always false. All right, that's why that never happens, in other words, okay? All right, there's our 2 examples of this. I hope you found that helpful.